Well, several years ago, I heard something for the first time. Since then, I've heard it many times, but I heard it for the first time, and it struck me as odd. There was a Christian musician who had just won an award as either Artist of the Year or Album of the Year, and his response to winning that award was, "I am humbled by this." And like I said, it struck me as odd because I don't think getting an award and being told that you're the best at something is a very humbling experience. I mean, have you ever had an actual humbling experience? It's usually something hard, maybe even painful, and it could be something that's very embarrassing. But it's something that makes you realize that you're not as great as you thought you were. You know, like the kid who thought he was the absolute best basketball player in the world and he could beat anyone in a game, but then he got beaten and beaten badly. That's humbling. Or like the student who thinks he is the smartest person and everyone smarter than everyone else, and he doesn't need to study for the test. And then he goes in and takes a test, and what happens? He fails it, and everyone else passes. That's a humbling experience. Or like the criminal who sits in court with a smile on his face, gloating about how he is going to get off and how he's going to be free. But then he's sentenced to prison, and his expression changes. You see, sometimes we have experiences that chip away at our pride, or maybe demolish our pride. And we realize that we are not in control, but God is. And our focus is shifted off of ourselves onto God. And we recognize the greatness and the power and the sovereignty of God. And we acknowledge that anything that I have, any skill, any intelligence that I have, is because of God. God is in control. And this is a lesson that Nebuchadnezzar had to learn. It is a lesson that many people would do well to learn. But you don't want to learn it the way Nebuchadnezzar learned it. And this morning we're actually going to look at two stories. They're about two different men who were both very arrogant. And one of them, Nebuchadnezzar, finally comes to his senses. But both of them learn who is really in control. So we begin in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. So Nebuchadnezzar here is making a proclamation to his entire empire. It's not a law decree, it's actually praise. It's praise for the Most High God. In other words, Daniel's God, the one true God, the one who Daniel called the God of heaven. And this is happening probably about 30 years after what we saw in the last chapter, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were delivered from the fiery furnace. So it's towards the end of Nebuchadnezzar's life. And he's doing this, making this proclamation in response to things God has done in his life. And so he's praising God because he's recognized God's sovereignty and his greatness. But how did he come to recognize this? Well, God has shown him signs and wonders. In other words, God did miraculous things and Nebuchadnezzar witnessed it. So, for example, God told Daniel the content of Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the interpretation of the dream. He rescued Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fiery furnace, which Nebuchadnezzar thought no one could do. In fact, he said, what God is there who could do this, could save you? And another thing, there's another incident that he's going to tell us about now that he witnessed. But these powerful signs have shown Nebuchadnezzar that God is in control, that he's sovereign, that his rule lasts forever. And so even as great and powerful of a king as Nebuchadnezzar is, he's nothing compared to God. And so God, Nebuchadnezzar has learned, God can take any king's rule away from him at any time. And Nebuchadnezzar is king because God has allowed him or made him king. And the king declares that God is in control and always will be, that there is no end to God's reign. And now, when we read this statement from Nebuchadnezzar and others at the end of the chapter, we may wonder if Nebuchadnezzar is converted. Has he become a believer in the one true God? Is he now fully committed to the true God? Now, I would say it's possible, but we can't really know. But it doesn't totally seem like it from other things he says. He still talks about his gods or his God. And he very well could be just a polytheist, someone who has many gods, which we know that he was that, but who has now come to a place of realizing that this God, the God of heaven, is higher or greater than any other so-called God. And he calls him the Most High God. But starting in verse 4, Nebuchadnezzar goes on and tells the story of what happened. And he says that he was at ease and he was prospering. So things were going well for him, very well for him. And his empire was firmly established. And he was very wealthy. And he had no fear of any enemy. There were no threats because he had subdued all of them. And we know from history that Babylon was this huge and magnificent city. And it was very strong, had very strong, impenetrable walls. And so he's feeling very good and totally comfortable, absolutely secure, completely relaxed. But all of that changes because he has a dream. And he knows that dreams mean something. And so now he's agitated and stressed, and he needs to know what the dream means. And so he calls all his wise men in and to interpret the dream for him, but none of them can. And when we hear this, especially after reading the first chapter or second chapter, we think, where's Daniel? Right? Well, let's read verse 8. At last, Daniel came in before me. So Nebuchadnezzar is talking here. He's narrating here. At last, Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belteshazzar after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you, tell me the visions of my dream that I saw and their interpretation. So, there's a few significant things here to note. First of all, Nebuchadnezzar refers to Daniel by both of his names. And then he explains that the name Belteshazzar, his Babylonian name, is related to the king's God. And this reminds us that Daniel has a relationship with the true God and that Nebuchadnezzar is an idolater. Secondly, Daniel is called the chief of the magicians. So he's been in this position for a long time. He's been the top wise man for a long time, for many years now. And this suggests he was very good at his job and that God has given him great success. And then thirdly, the king has complete confidence that Daniel will be able to interpret the dream. But why does he have this confidence? Well, he says because Daniel has the spirit of the gods in him. And he goes on to say, nothing is too difficult for him. Well, this means that this statement is both an accurate and inaccurate statement. Nebuchadnezzar is saying that Daniel is able to communicate with the gods and gain wisdom from them and insight from this unique relationship. It's true that Daniel can communicate with God, the one true God, only one God. And it's not really that that nothing is too difficult for Daniel, but nothing is too difficult for God. And Daniel knows all this, and he has actually made it clear. He says, it's not me, it's God. God knows everything, and he reveals it to Daniel. But all in all, the king is confident that Daniel will have the answer because of his relationship with God. Look at verse 10. We hear the dream. The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the vision of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time pass over him. This sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. So to put this simply, this is what he saw in the dream. There was a tree in the middle of the earth that grew huge and strong. It provided food and shelter to the entire earth. Then a heavenly messenger, he calls him a watcher, an angel, came and said to chop the tree down and strip off all of its leaves and fruit. So it's no longer providing anything good for anyone. But then there's the stump. The stump, along with its roots, is left, and it's protected with some kind of metal band. Then it becomes obvious that the tree represents a person, a man, because the stump is now referred to as he. And so this man will lose his mind and will live like an animal and eat grass for 7 periods of time. Now, this may refer to 7 years, it could refer to 7 seasons, or some other shorter period of time. But the 7 suggests that it will be the full amount of time to accomplish the desired outcome. And the reason that this will all happen is so that all people will know that the Most High God is in control. He's in control over everyone and everything. And the thing is, this is exactly what's happening in this chapter. This is what we find. Nebuchadnezzar is announcing the greatness and the sovereignty of God. Now, when Daniel hears the dream, he is visibly shaken. It upsets him. Look at verse 19. It says, then Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. The king answered and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. Belteshazzar answered and said, my lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for their enemies. So after Nebuchadnezzar tells him to not let the dream bother him, go ahead, he encourages them to tell the interpretation. Daniel says that he wishes that it was for someone else. He wishes that this message was about the king's enemies rather than for him. See, it appears that Daniel doesn't want anything bad to happen to Nebuchadnezzar like this. But he goes on to tell the meaning of the dream. So let me just explain what he says. So the tree represents Nebuchadnezzar. He had built his entire empire and had become strong. And he ruled over most of the known world. And then you have the watcher. The watcher from heaven is bringing a message from God because God has made a decree about the king. God decrees he will lose his mind. The king will lose his mind, and he will live in isolation away from other people, and he will live like an animal. He will eat grass like an ox. And he's going to stay outside so he becomes wet with the dew. And this will last for 7 periods of time till Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that God is in control. And that stump is preserved, showing that this condition will be temporary. And when Nebuchadnezzar recognizes God's sovereignty, that God is in control, his mind and his kingdom will both be restored to him. And as soon as Daniel finishes explaining the meaning of the dream, he gives the king some advice. Repent, change, and do what's right. You see, Daniel understands that God is merciful and that he might not bring this judgment upon Nebuchadnezzar if he responds well to this message and does what's right. But look at verse 28. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence for the glory of my majesty? While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among the men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. And so a year later, a year after the dream, he's walking around on the roof of his palace, admiring the view. And he gives full expression to his pride. He says, is not this great Babylon? The thing is, Babylon was great. It was a huge city. It was full of amazing feats of engineering and beautiful architecture. I mean, you remember hearing about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was truly a sight to see. And if that's all that he had said, maybe it would have been okay, but that's not all he said. He said, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my power for the glory of my majesty? You see, he thinks that he himself is responsible for this great city and everything in it, and that it all declares his glory and majesty. And so it's all just a great monument to him himself, to his own power. And so he's saying that everything he has accomplished is due to his own power, his own strength. And the thing is, he knows that God gave Israel into his hands because God told him. He knows that God had raised him up for this purpose, to lead, to be king, given this position because God had told him. But Nebuchadnezzar is arrogant, and he's refusing to acknowledge God. You see, Nebuchadnezzar thinks that he is the greatest, that he is the most intelligent, that he is most powerful, but God is. Nebuchadnezzar thinks that he is in control, but God is. And God immediately condemns him for his arrogance. And he carries out his decree that he had warned him about in the dream. So who's in control? Who's the Most High? Well, it's obvious, right? I mean, Nebuchadnezzar may be in the highest position on earth. He is at this time the most powerful man on earth. But he's not God. God is the Most High. God is in control. Let's keep reading verse 34. At the end of these days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. So when the time of the punishment is completed, Nebuchadnezzar finally recognizes God for who he is. And his reason returns to him. So he's thinking clearly now, and he praises God. And he finally recognizes and admits that God is in control, and he gave honor to God. And he says that God doesn't have to answer to anyone. And he does what he wants. And when Nebuchadnezzar comes to his senses and he praises God, God gives him his kingdom back. And we're told that his advisors, they seek him out. In other words, they want him to be king again. And not only that, but his kingdom is made even stronger than before. In other words, God is blessing him. God honors those who honor him. Well, then Nebuchadnezzar concludes with this one last statement of praise for God. And he calls him the King of heaven. But Nebuchadnezzar says that everything God does is right. And he's able to humble the prideful. Now, Nebuchadnezzar learned this from experience. He was arrogant. He was prideful. He thought no one could bring him down. But God did. And it was quick and easy. But in saying this, Nebuchadnezzar is also recognizing that his pride was wrong, and that God was just in humbling him. Nebuchadnezzar is proclaiming that God is in control, that he does what he wants, and everything he does is right. Well, we're going to move on to chapter 5. And in chapter 5, we see another king. Now, it's again another about 30 years later. And Nebuchadnezzar has died long ago, and there have been 4 kings now since him. And so the current king of Babylon is actually named Nabonidus. But here we read about King Belshazzar. Well, Belshazzar is actually the son of Nabonidus, and they are co-regents. They are ruling together. Nabonidus is living in an area down south, well, in a place where is in modern-day Saudi Arabia. And Belshazzar is living in the city of Babylon and ruling from there. So we pick this up, chapter 5, verse 1. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple, Nebuchadnezzar is referred to as his father, but it's really talking about him as a predecessor. But who Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, be brought that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And so Belshazzar is throwing a huge party for himself and his wives and other noblemen in Babylon. And after drinking for a while, he decides to have the gold and silver cups and things that were taken from God's temple to be brought in to the party so they can drink from them during the party. So what's going on here? There's actually a couple questions here. Why are they having this party? And why drink out of these items taken from God's temple? Well, there are some different answers have been suggested to this, but there's one that seems to me to make the most sense in view of historical facts and in view of the criticism that Daniel will make of Belshazzar later on in the chapter, that he should have known better than doing this. And so there's a couple things going on here. First of all, at the time of this party, all of the Babylonian Empire, except for the city of Babylon, had been conquered by the Persians. In fact, Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, the high king, had fled from the Persian army just a few days before this. And so it may seem like an odd time to have a party. But the city of Babylon was extremely well fortified. It was strong. I mean, it had thick walls and 2 pairs of them. And they had enough food stored up for years in case the city was sieged by an army. And so they weren't worried at all. He was completely confident, and I would suggest too confident. But this party may have been to bolster the morale of Babylon's leaders. The rest of this empire may be taken, but Babylon won't fall. So they have a party. And then when Nebuchadnezzar took the gold and silver items from God's temple in Jerusalem, when he did that, it was meant as a symbol of that Babylon's God had conquered Israel's God. Now, of course, we know that this isn't what happened, right? We've seen this in our study in the prophets. It's been made perfectly clear that God was not conquered, but God actually sent Nebuchadnezzar, and that God gave his people into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar and sent them into exile. See, God used Nebuchadnezzar to punish his people for their sin and to teach them to be faithful. But apparently Belshazzar hasn't yet learned that God is in control. And he isn't worried about disrespecting or dishonoring God. And so when the items that were taken from the temple, when people of that time would take items from temples, those items were usually treated with respect as if they were sacred. But Belshazzar doesn't do that here. But there may be a little bit more to this. You see, many years before this, Isaiah, the prophet, had prophesied that Cyrus, the Persian, would conquer Babylon. And now, the Medo-Persian army has taken almost the entire empire. It seems that Belshazzar may be saying, but you won't take Babylon. Belshazzar's drinking from the cups looks like an act of defiance against God. Like he would most likely know this prophecy of Isaiah or know about it, but he's sure that Babylon won't fall, that God can't take Babylon. See, he appears to be mocking God and claiming that Babylon's God is greater than the true God, Israel's God. Because not only did they conquer Israel and bring those items out of his temple and bring it back to Babylon, but now he is going to drink from those same items in honor of his own God. And so they bring these things out and they start drinking from them. And this is what happens. Look at verse 5. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. And so they bring all of the wise men in, or the cups in, and they start drinking from them. And as soon as they start drinking from these dedicated things, these things that were dedicated to the worship of God, God responds. And they see what looks like a human hand writing on the wall with his fingers. And the king is terrified, as he should be. And he almost collapses. And he has all his wise men come in, and he offers them great reward if any one of them can read it and explain the message that was written on the wall. But none of them can. And now he's even more scared, and they don't know what to do. Verse 10. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall. And the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretation. And so this queen, she isn't Belshazzar's wife, because his wives are all at the party already. This is likely his mom or one of the wives of one of the previous kings. But the significant thing is that she knows Daniel. You know, Daniel's an old man by now, and so she may be older too, but she knows Daniel. And apparently Daniel didn't still hold that high position that he had under Nebuchadnezzar. There have been other kings, and other kings choose their preferred leaders. And like I said, and Daniel's pretty old at this time, but Belshazzar doesn't know Daniel. So the queen tells him about Daniel and his great wisdom and his abilities and his high position under Nebuchadnezzar. And she says with confidence, Daniel will be able to give you an interpretation. He'll tell you what the writing means. Verse 13. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king of my father brought from Judah. Now notice that when Daniel is brought in, the first thing Belshazzar mentions is that Daniel is one of the exiles from Judah, that he's from the conquered peoples. This may be implying that he's somehow lesser, or it may be making the connection between Daniel and the God that Belshazzar has just blasphemed. But then he goes on to say that he's been told about Daniel and all he can do, and he offers him rewards if he can explain the message. And in the next verses, Daniel, he rejects the rewards. He says, I don't want them. But he agrees to give an interpretation of the writing. But before explaining the message, he calls out the king. See, because he points out that Babylon's great king Nebuchadnezzar, his success came from God. And then when Nebuchadnezzar became arrogant, God humbled him. But when Nebuchadnezzar recognized that God is in control, God put him back on the throne. So Nebuchadnezzar learned his lesson and recognized God's greatness. But what has Belshazzar done? Look at verse 22. Daniel says to him, and you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways you have not honored. So Belshazzar knew all this about Nebuchadnezzar. He knew what had happened. But it made no difference in the way Belshazzar acted. He knew the truth, but it had no effect on him. He knew it, so he should have humbled himself before God, but he arrogantly defies God. He made light of God. He acted as if God was small and powerless and insignificant. And in doing so, he even took items of gold and silver from God's temple that were used in the worship of God, and he used them to worship false gods. False gods who were made of gold and silver and lesser metals and of wood and of stone. Idols that are mindless and powerless, who can't even hear or see. And he elevated those mindless, worthless pieces of wood and stone and metal over the true God, who knows all and who is over all. He elevated them over the true God, who gives and takes life, over the God who is truly in control and who deserves to be honored. Verse 24. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So, the writing on the wall came from God in response to the king's defiance of God. And there were 4 words written on the wall: numbered, weighed, and divided. And Daniel explains that the kingdom of Babylon, including Belshazzar's reign, is coming to an end. You see, numbered means that God has numbered the king's days. The king has little time left. And the word is repeated to emphasize the certainty of this. Your days are numbered. Weighed explains why his days are numbered. And he's using the illustration of being weighed on a scale. And so you would put a weight on one side, that's the standard, and then you put other things on the other side and try and balance them out so that you know you have the right amount. Well, Belshazzar has been weighed, and he doesn't match up. He's fallen short of the standard. You see, he should have humbled himself and should have recognized his rightful place under God. He should have acknowledged God as the Most High God who is in control. But instead, he defied God. Also, he's an idolater, and he honored his false gods who aren't even gods over the true God. He deliberately blasphemed God, and he has been found guilty. And as a result, his kingdom is divided, meaning his rule is broken. The Medes and the Persians will take it, and it's certain. God has already given it to them. I mean, the Medes and the Persian army, the Medo-Persian army, they've already conquered the rest of the empire. And although Belshazzar doesn't know it, they are already moving on the city against the great city, Babylon. Verse 29. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So Belshazzar, he kept his word, and he rewarded Daniel, even though Daniel didn't want the rewards. And even though it really didn't matter, it didn't mean anything at this point. But the city was conquered that same night, and the king was killed. Now, historians tell us that the Euphrates River ran underneath the wall of the city of Babylon, ran right through the city of Babylon. So they had water all the time, right? But the Euphrates River ran under the wall, these impenetrable walls of the city. But the Persian army, they come along and they diverted the water of the river so that they could pass through the river, and they went in under the walls. They came in totally unnoticed. They took the city without a fight. And historians tell us there was this big party going on while they came into the city and took it. The city was taken without a fight, and the inhabitants welcomed their new king. And the mighty Babylon Empire ended, and the Medo-Persian Empire began. God is in control. And we are to live understanding that God is in control. God is in control. He alone is God. There is no one like him. There is no one who can overpower him or replace him. From everlasting to everlasting, he is God. And his rule will never end. Now, knowing this is a comfort to his people, especially when we find ourselves in difficult situations. God is not unaware. When we're going through hard times, God is not unaware. He knows what we're going through. He knows our condition, and nothing is outside of his control. He is able to do anything, and he does what is right. He will do what's best and what will fulfill his purposes. And when we remember that God is in control, we remember that he raises up kings, and you could say presidents, politicians, leaders, and he brings them down. God is in control. And he works through people in this world to carry out his purpose. You may not even know who he's working through. And you might be surprised sometimes who he's worked through. In fact, just like he used Nebuchadnezzar, God may use someone who doesn't fully know or understand or believe the truth to declare what is true and what is right, or to bring about things that are right. God is in control, even when it may not look like it to us. Everything is moving towards the fulfillment of his plan. And another thing, the last couple of weeks, we've talked about living for God and being faithful to him while living in this world, in a culture, society that is sometimes antagonistic against Christians and against God. But being faithful in this world and living in this society sometimes means that we have to speak up and even confront. God may put you in a position where you have to call out wrong and point to truth. Like Daniel had to speak this message, God's message, to both of these kings. And at one time, at least we know, he was very uncomfortable doing it. But you may find that God has put you in the right place at the right time to speak truth. And when God gives you the opportunity to stand up for what's right, or to simply speak the truth, or to share the gospel, do it. And we can't leave these two chapters without speaking to one obvious application. Watch out for pride. Don't be arrogant. Pride causes people to think that they should be able to make their own rules and to live however they want, that they don't need to obey God. Pride rejects the rule of God, God's rule, and rejects that he has the right to rule. Pride makes people think that they know better than God, and will even cause them to question whether or not God is just or fair or does what's right. Pride causes people to refuse to submit to God, even though he is right and he is sovereign and he is good. Now the reality is, one day every knee will bow to the one who is worthy of all worship, to the one who is owed our devotion and obedience, to the one who is in control, to the one who we are all accountable to the one who created us and loves us, to the one who offers forgiveness and mercy. One day every knee will bow, whether they want to or not. And I just want to say this morning, don't wait till then. Recognize God for who he is and humble yourself before him. If you haven't already, believe in Jesus. Put your faith, your trust in Jesus, and be reconciled to God. And then listen to him and live to honor him. This morning, let me just close with these words of praise from Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel 2. My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted high because of the Lord. I loudly denounce my enemies, for I am happy that you delivered me. No one is holy like the Lord. There is no one other than you. There is no rock like our God. Don't keep speaking so arrogantly, letting proud talk come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God who knows. He evaluates what people do. The bows of warriors are shattered, but those who stumble find their strength reinforced. Those who are well fed hire themselves out to earn food, but the hungry no longer lack. Even the barren woman gives birth to 7, but the one with many children withers away. The Lord both kills and gives life. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord impoverishes and makes wealthy. He humbles and he exalts. He lifts the weak from the dust. He raises the poor from the ash heap to seat them with princes and to bestow on them an honored position. The foundations of the earth belong to the Lord, and he has placed the world on them. He watches over his holy ones, but the wicked are made speechless in the darkness. For it is not by one's own strength that one prevails. The Lord shatters his adversaries. He thunders against them from the heavens. The Lord executes judgment to the ends of the earth. He will strengthen his king and exalt the power of his anointed one. God is in control.